Okay. Okay. So I went back to the YouTube live stream and I can hear my replay feedback. And we still have 6 minutes. It was faster than I expected. I think it's because I accidentally did the first time, so this time it was faster.
Yes, yeah. I think since we have all been using Zoom, it doesn't take too much time to set up anymore.
Christine, do all of the presentations get posted someplace?
Yes, so we have 2 different areas we post the presentations, or I should say if the presenter allows us to record, then
Okay.
we record. Since this one, I invited the economics special interest group too. It will go on the economics special interest YouTube channel. Let me get that.
Oh, okay.
But if it's WPI System Dynamics Club only hosting, then it goes on the WPI one. So this link should go to the System Dynamics Economics SIG. Professor Radzicki started this.
Oh, okay.
Or Raffet started this YouTube, I don't remember. Both of them.
Okay.
And I help manage, but I claim that I do not know anything, or I know very, very little about economics, so please don't ask me any questions about the presentation. You should ask the presenters.
Okay. And the WPI stuff?
This is the WPI stuff. Hold on, I need to go to that area. Because I'm signed into the SD Econ SIG, so it's a little confusing for me. Everything is usually in
You probably
my...
told me once before and I lost track of it.
Here. And then the second one is the SD Club.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so I actually have some questions for Professor Saeed. I forgot to ask this when we were chit-chatting before. Do you want me to keep my video on so you can see my face while you're presenting? I don't know if you like that or not. And
Sure. I'd like to see the faces.
And do you allow people to ask questions at any time, or should they wait till the end?
Yeah, I think they can stop me and ask questions. That'll be fine.
Okay.
If they want to wait, that'll be okay too. I mean, I'm easy on this.
Okay. Because in the intro, when I say welcome, blah, 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 then I say you can ask at any time. Although I guess the presenter can say so too, but sometimes they don't remember.
Yes.
Too. And sometimes I forget too.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, Christine.
So I was also worried when we switched to the later time that we would lose people in Europe and East Asia due to the time difference.
Right.
And that's why I was wondering, should we move back to the mornings, Eastern time? Or
for me, it's okay. It's flexible. Fridays, usually I don't have classes, so it's flexible for me personally.
Yeah. And anyway, anytime it's inconvenient for somebody around the world. So
Well,
trade-offs.
further down, like maybe Middle East would be another 2 or 3 hours. Now it's 8 here, so maybe I mean it's dinner time indeed, but it is not so bad. I suppose 2 or 3 time zones down east should be even, well, maybe somehow inconvenient perhaps, and the Far East for sure, or Australia.
I usually have my classes in the morning on Fridays. So this time works better for me, but that should not be a serious consideration.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Rafit. Speaking of somebody who's in an inconvenient time zone, I think it's bedtime for you, right?
What time is it in Saudi Arabia?
It's 11 p.m.
11 p.m. Oh, not too bad. Yeah.
Yep,
3 hours after
it's
here.
fine.
Okay. It's on the top of the hour. Usually I wait 1 or 2 minutes when people are switching meetings. It might take them some time. I actually wonder if we should change the time because others schedule 1.5 hour sometimes for the SIG meetings. So I don't know if the econ SIG meeting should also be 1.5 hours, but we follow the WPI collective learning meeting times, which is 1 hour.
Mhm.
I don't know. This
I'm
is
okay with you moving it back earlier.
this is a struggle for me because this is not just the WPI one, but it's also economics SIG. So I don't know what I should do.
Make a decision and ask for forgiveness later.
I asked my professors, like Professor Saeed and Radziki, what their opinions are on this.
Well, from a personal perspective, afternoon is better for me. As I said, I have my classes usually which end about 3 o'clock. But I mean, if it's convenient to the others, that we should change it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start the recording now. So I do both, just in case. We're currently already live, for those who are not aware. Okay, welcome everybody to this week's collective learning meeting and System Dynamics Society Economics Special Interest Group meeting. Today our presenter is Professor Khalid Saeed, who is a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI. And he will be presenting Connecting Feedback Map to Computable Model. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. Please unmute yourself to ask the question, or you can also use the chat if you're in an area where you're not able to speak up. I will monitor the chat and ask the question for you. Okay. Take it away, Professor Saeed.
Thank you, Christine. It's always a pleasure to share ideas with this group. And I've been thinking about this subject for a long time. I feel there's a disconnect between the two representations that we use in our work, that is the feedback maps and the stock and flow diagrams. We use feedback maps to explain behavior, and stock and flow diagrams are part of the simulatable computable model. I've seen some dissatisfaction expressed about mapping between the two. Back in the 80s, there was an article by our colleague, Professor Richardson, on this, and there have been some ideas presented, but it has bothered me over many years, and I've been thinking about it. And I think I have an explanation, and I'll share it with you with the expectation that you'll tell me what's wrong or right with it. Actually, a few years ago, I participated in the inaugural seminar of the European System Dynamics Master's Program that was held at University of Bergen. And one interesting point of debate at the seminar was a chicken and egg problem. Which came first, stocks and flows or feedback loops? And people made presentations are going for both sides. I don't think there was a resolution to this question, but anyways, that was an interesting artifact to me. In my thinking, those questions are irrelevant as the two presentations are really intertwined and must not be seen in isolation. In fact, seeing them in isolation has brought harm to the field, which I'll also try to explain. So let me see if I can go to my next slide. So first of all, we must understand that feedback is not unique to system dynamics. Its importance has been recognized across disciplines. So in engineering, we design oscillators, control systems, amplifiers, and we understand what gain is. And since Forrester was a control engineer, he brought in a lot of concepts from control engineering to the social systems that he tried to tackle. Now, in economics, there is a lot of feedback. We have economic cycles, we have market clearing systems, we have economic growth. Growth is a manifestation of positive feedback loop. Others involve negative feedback. But I've never seen feedback maps in economics text. So there are explanations, but not in very clear terms. And in system dynamics, feedback is everywhere. Of course, there is the instability that we explain with feedback. There is goal-seeking behavior, and there is growth that we explain with feedback. And elsewhere, there are stories, fables, woolly narratives, which try to explain feedback, I think not very successfully. Now, let's start. I think there is something that I wanted to say something about before I went to specific representations. I feel that representing feedback is not very satisfactory in all areas, including system dynamics, in which we have the feedback maps as well as the stock flow diagrams, and I'll explain why. Now, in engineering, we use signal flow diagrams. Since my background is engineering, I know a wee bit about signal flow diagrams. And they appear to have feedback, but actually they show the path of the signal that's flowing. And I'll explain in a moment what that is. In economics, we use static curves. We use woolly narratives. And when we get confused, we refer to invisible hand, of course, but we are always talking about feedback there in the theoretical framework. In system dynamics, there are sort of minor feedbacks in the basic policy functions, which I think Barry Richmond was first to call generic processes. These are the decision rules like compounding, draining, stock adjustment, which are driven by minor feedback loops. And then we have causal maps connecting conservative systems. So conservative systems, a conservative system might contain one or more connected stocks. And the feedback which connects those systems is a major feedback. And at a later time, we start calling it dynamic hypothesis, which was a term that Forrester never used. The first time I came across it was in a memo that was written by Dale Runge, in which he mentioned dynamic hypothesis. But we adopted this term. It's a good term. It really represents feedback between subsystems of a system that we are trying to model. I think this should be kept in mind. And then we have generic systems archetypes, coupled feedback loops, which are simple feedback systems originated by, I guess, Peter Senge. And after that, there are many variations on it. On this, and we try to infer behavior of systems from these coupled feedback loops. Sometimes they become too complex to interpret. And elsewhere, we use, of course, metaphor fables. Now, first coming to the engineering representation of a diagram, and in this case, it's a mass flow system. Basically, there is a discrepancy here, actually a signal created here, which comes from two types of forces which are acting on mass spring system. And that signal drives a process, a computation, which gives us velocity. And the velocity drives another system that gives us position. And position, when compared with the rest position, again creates another signal, which can be amplified. This signal is, by the way, displacement, and that creates a restoration process. So I want to emphasize that this path, although it appears like a feedback loop, it's really the path of flow of the signal in the circuit or in the system that we are dealing with. It's not an information path. Feedback loop, as we define in system dynamics, is an information path, and this is the path of flow of the signal. And in economics, as I mentioned, we have static curves, such as supply and demand schedules. Narratives are used to describe the dynamics of these curves. And of course, as I said, we use invisible hand when we cannot fully take command over the narrative. Likewise, the behavior of a firm. The firm is viewed as a rational agent guided by the invisible hand. That implies really that there are repetitive decisions being made by multiple actors, and these decisions are driven by discrepancy to correct error. And the decision process of multiple people and their outcome, the repetitive correction and how it creates optimal behavior, is all merged to one agent, which is called a rational agent. It's a terrible abstraction, which is very difficult to understand and also difficult to verify, but it's very expedient as far as use of mathematics differential equations is concerned. Which brings us to the calculus of stocks and flows. Feedback is implicit in the mathematical representation of systems, of a system of differential equations. System dynamics software actually rewrites the abstract computation into an intuitive format, then graphically represents them in stock and flow diagrams. So this is the differential equation format, and this is the intuitive format that we transform it into. And the intuitive format is very easy, very amenable to comparison with bathtub faucets, drains, and we use an abstract map of bathtub faucet drains. The system dynamics uses both stock and flow and feedback loops. I want to emphasize that. And let me bring in a system dynamics map of the mass spring system that I showed you an engineering representation of that system. This is the system dynamics representation. So there is the position which is tracked in this stock. Velocity changes that position, or an external disturbance can change that position. And the position, when compared with the rest position, will create a restoring force that affects momentum. At the same time, gravitational force affects that momentum, and momentum drives velocity. Now, you might say, hey, this is a feedback loop, but is it, is my question. This is an information path. This is an information path. This is not an information path. This is not an information path, and the direction of arrow is strange, not even connected to the feedback loop. This is, again, not an information path, it's a flow, and its direction, again, confuses us. Likewise, this one here. So I want to resolve that confusion by redefining feedback and how it's connected to stock and flow system. Here is the market clearing dynamics rendered into a stock and flow diagram. There is the inventory that drives the price, and price influences demand through demand elasticity, and supply through the supply elasticity. And you might say that there is a feedback here, and is there a feedback here? Again, these paths are a bit confusing, at least to me. And I don't think that we can see clearly the feedbacks loops here, which are our explanatory tools. So we are unable to connect our explanatory tool to the computational process that we map in these diagrams. And that's the problem. So to summarize, feedback maps are detached from computable stock and flow structure. Use of feedback maps in isolation from computable models, which has happened, has created complex diagrams that are inadequate for understanding the contingencies of an inference. You can say, hey, there is this feedback which can create such and such behavior, but every inference has contingencies, and you cannot explain these from inferences made with the feedback maps. Use of stock and flow structure not intimately tied to feedback maps has created complex models whose behavior cannot be explained. So they're just used for extrapolating behavior, or so to speak, forecasting, which is, again, an inappropriate use of system dynamics. So the problem is to connect feedback map to stock and flow structure systematically. Now, some basics. First, we should recognize that feedback loop is an information relationship between undifferentiated variables. There are no stocks, no flows, just undifferentiated variables connected by information relationships. Keep that in some corner of your mind. Stock and flow structure includes both conserved flows and information relationships between a variety of variables. There are stocks flows, there are other computations which we call converters and graphical functions and so on and so forth. feedback loops cannot be discerned easily from stock and flow structure. The variables in a feedback loop are different from the variables in a stock flow map. And in fact, there is a hierarchical relationship between the two, which is not very clearly understood. So that's what we are trying to articulate. Although there have been attempts made, stock and flow structure cannot be and should not be mapped into feedback diagrams, because the feedback is a more abstract version of the model that you are trying to represent. So let me try to explain the difference using a very simple model. This is a population growth model. It really contains only minor feedback loops which underlie decision process like compounding, draining, and stock adjustment. These minor feedback loops are different from what Forrester surmised as building blocks of systems. We'll come to it in a moment. But I'll use them to illustrate the difference between stock flow diagrams and the feedback loops. So this is a very simple model. We start with this. The feedback loops, which explain the behavior of this system, are here. There is a positive feedback loop and there's a negative feedback loop. And both these feedback loops are completely information relationships, and the variables are completely undifferentiated. So that's as I explained below. Now, can we get to this one from the first one? That's the question. And I tried a few things. I tried to draw a map, a computational map of each one of these three variables in Stella. And so I have births here. This is the birth calculation sector. That's what I call it. Births are a function of population and fraction birth rate. Then there's a population calculation sector, which contains all these computations. And then there is a death calculation sector, which contains all these computations. And if you place these in modules in Stella and go to the upper layer of module map, this is what you get. This is undifferentiated variables connected only by information. And that's the relationship. In fact, each stock, each flow, each converter cannot be mapped directly into a feedback map, but clusters of them, which can be placed in some logical subsystems, can be mapped. And fortunately, we have software that can do it for us. So we can make use of that software. Another example, a simple example again, the carbon dioxide cycle. The emission go into this stock and they are assimilated. In the first instance, the assimilation rate depends on the stock itself. And then the fraction assimilated changes with the overload capacity. And again, we divide it into equation clusters. There is the emissions equation system. There is the carbon dioxide stock tracking. There is the fraction assimilated, again, a bunch of equations there. And then there is the capacity overload, a bunch of equations. And if you place them in modules and create a map of the modules, we have the feedback loops driving it, which can explain the behavior of this system. So the stock and flow structure will help create the simulations. The feedback map will help explain the behavior. The sensitivity analysis on the stock and flow structure will bring out the contingencies, the modalities under which certain inferences can be made, and the contingencies under which those do not hold. And that's very important part of the analysis, which is lost in just looking at the feedback loops. Now, I'm giving you some homework. This is the feedback map of the Hooke's law. And here's the feedback map of the market clearing system. And I've shown you the models. I'll make available this PowerPoint. Christine, is it possible to post it somewhere? And try converting the stock and flow structure using modules into these maps as I've explained. I think this will be a good exercise. Now, the question is what I'm saying new to system dynamics? What do you think? Is it new? Actually, my answer is no, it's not new. In fact, Forrester saw this hierarchy some 70 years ago, and he tried to construct it manually because software was not available to do this. And he wired it into his organization of dynamo equations that he wrote for his models. And I dug a little bit into it, and I was amazed that he thought of it a long time ago. And again, and I think it's our loss that we have missed it. So first, let's look at Forrester's Principles of System Structure. This is from his book, Principles of Systems. I call it Principles of System Structure because he wanted to write 2 volumes, Principles of System Structure and Principles of System Behavior. He never got to the second volume. Our friend Alan Graham's thesis, which is available in MIT dissertation archives, actually addressed the subject of principles of system behavior. And he sort of defined in a way generic systems which are part of principles of system behavior. So that was a digression. I just want to explain why I insist on calling it principles of system structure, because that was the original intent. He organizes these principles into chapters, and I will discuss here only 2 principles. The first one is 4.21, which is about the decision rules. He says decisions always occur within feedback loops. And it's about how decisions are made and how they create an iterative process. And it describes generic processes at decision level. It deals with minor feedback loops. So that's the first place that he talks about feedback that drives the decision process. Then he talks about the structural element of systems. This is another feedback loop. It's the basic structural element in systems. Dynamic behavior is generated by this feedback. More complex systems are assemblies of interacting feedback loops. So I want to make sure that we understand that the first principle really concerns the decision-making process, which we later organized into compounding, draining, stock adjustment, these decision rules, generic decision rules. The second principle is about the feedback between the sub-elements, subsystems of the system that we try to model. He actually practiced this, and if you see some of his older writings, and the oldest one I could find was Forrester's market growth model. There is an article he wrote back in the 50s about market growth. And this diagram is actually taken from his article. And he calls these loops in market growth. And you notice that there is this salesman tracking subsector in the system, and there is a order booked deliveries sort of production system. And then there is the process that determines sales effectiveness against, again, a cluster of equations, and a fourth cluster of equations that tracks the changes in production capacity. So he organized his dynamo equations into 4 clusters, and these are those 4 clusters. Now, question?
Yes, there have been a few questions. Just I
I
didn't
can
like to
pause
interject.
and
Yes.
respond to them.
Yes. So one was, this is essentially the difference between causal loop diagrams and stock flow diagrams, correct?
The essential difference between causal loop diagrams and stock flow diagrams. Stock flow diagrams represents the computational process that we use. The causal loop diagrams track the information paths only. Stock flow diagrams have both information paths and actual flows. And the appearance of feedbacks that we see, in fact, comes from both of them, and it's not very clear. I personally cannot use stock flow diagrams to explain behavior because the feedback loops are not very clear to me. The flows, which are part of the feedback loops, sometimes have confusing directions also, like the death rate means that deaths are flowing out, and then you've got to process information in your mind to think, this might be part of a feedback loop. I want to see feedback loop as information relationships, period. And I showed you how to create those.
So going from stock flow to a feedback loop is not intuitive because of the directions of the arrows. Okay.
Yes, but if you create a subsystem which contains the whole computation of the stock and the computation of each flow, like let me go back. Like these 4 computations, you put them into modules, and those computations are connected through feedback loops.
There's another question about, the question is, must we draw causal loop diagrams before sketching the stock and flow or creating the stock flow model? If so, do we have to have multiple loops? I'm not so sure.
It's very helpful. That's what we have started calling dynamic hypothesis. But this feedback diagram should be at a higher level of aggregation. The stock flow structure is at a lower level of aggregation. So the feedback diagram, which we have come to call dynamic hypothesis, in fact, should be the causal structure that defines relationship between clusters of stock and flow structure that we have come to call sectors, model sectors. So we got to organize model into sectors which are meaningful, which can have a meaningful causal relationship. And that's what we should draw. There is absolutely no sense in drawing a very detailed causal map, which we then try to change into stock and flow map. There's very little gain from that process.
Another question in the chat is, why would the velocity position diagram not suffice as a causal loop?
Let's go back to that diagram. You mean this one? Yeah, the problem I have with it is that the position is actually changed by both these flows, and that is not included in this causal loop here. Second, and this is an actual flow. This is an actual flow. This is an information relationship. And to make things more exciting, I have used double these arrows, which mean that flow can happen in any direction, and it can. And it might seem like it gives the appearance of a feedback loop, but the definition I gave that variables should be undifferentiated, which means there's no difference between stock and flow. And the relationships should be information relationships. This is a simple example in which you can make an inference, but in a complex situation, I don't think we should use this as a representation of feedback. Actually, I have called Kareem a few times. Stella has a utility that allows you to put the polarity on these arrows in a stock and flow diagram. I think that should not be allowed because that polarity is irrelevant. He told me that a lot of their customers want it, so they have it. Fine. So that facility exists, but I advise my students not to use it. So can we go back to Christine?
Oh, there was one more.
Yes.
So why do flows need to be information flows?
Flows are not information flows. The links in a feedback map has to be information links, have to be information links. Right?
I think I
there
might
can
have
be information
misunderstood.
flows. I see. There can be information flows when information is conserved. There can be information flows, but those flows are different from the information links. Those flows are conserved when information goes from one point to the other through a link. It's not conserved.
Okay, and oh, never mind. That was just another comment. Sometimes I don't understand what's going on in the chat. My bad. I think we can go on.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about Forrester's principles of systems, and I explained two which concern the feedback loops. The first one relates to the decision-making process, involves some minor loops. The second one relates to the feedback that drives the systems, and that is clearly between clusters of that system, between subsystems, not between stock and flow. And I discussed this map that Forrester, actually young Forrester back in the 50s, created. And what I tried to do was I have his equations in his model, and I just put those equations in into the into modules. So there are 4 clusters in his equations: salesman, backlog, production capacity, and delivery delay. And I placed them in separate modules. And here is the module map, which came out of this process. Now you compare this with his module map. It's exactly what he had drawn, really intuitively. And now we have software that can draw that module map. looking at more of Forrester's models, here are the equation clusters in his world dynamics model. His equation clusters are divided into 6 sectors. And when you place those sectors in modules, here is the feedback map which comes out of it. I was a bit unhappy to see crisscrossing lines. I could not get rid of them. And what I did was I merged these 2 modules. I did not merge them. I actually made them sub-modules in a larger module. So I created a deeper hierarchy, 2-level hierarchy. And when I did that, I got this map here. Within capital investment, there are actually 2 sub-modules, food sector and the capital investment sector. And in fact, if you read his book, World Dynamics, when he explains behavior in terms of the feedback loops which are shown in this map here. This map as it is not shown. It's implicit, but that reflects in his explanations and also is implicitly there in the way he organized his equations. Next, let's look at the his urban dynamics equation clusters. Urban dynamics is the largest model that Forrester published. I'm saying that because the national model was not published. So when he wrote its equations, these are divided into 15 clusters. And when I programmed those clusters into modules, in fact, this is what the map looked like, which is terrible. You cannot make any sense out of this, all right? I could possibly move the stocks and create a cleaner map, but still there are too many feedbacks out there. And from the point of view of making any inference, especially an inference with any contingencies, is quite useless. So I turned to my friend Kareem Chakli, whom you all know. I don't know if he's on this meeting or not. And we discussed, are you there, Kareem? Hey, yeah. And we discussed the possibility of creating a deeper hierarchy, like modules within modules. And Kareem took it as a challenge. And this is what he came out with. And in fact, it's interesting that if you look at Forrester's explanation, they are really cast in terms of the feedbacks that are shown here. Within the workforce, businesses, and housing, there are other clusters, other modules here. And his explanations, feedback explanations also follow the feedback between those submodules. So when you are developing a complex model, a hierarchy that has more than 1 levels is very, very useful. And actually, I've been beating upon IC Systems to create a utility which allows us to program a model into deeper hierarchy. And for a long time, they shunned me. But then eventually, I think you guys created a project to achieve this. And this was the outcome, which is really very helpful. Now, I was curious how Forrester created the equations, wrote the equations so that this hierarchy is implicit in those equations. And as a student, this is the process which we were told to follow when we wrote model equations. You start with a stock. And first you go to its first connected flow and define the variables in that flow. Keep going until you hit another undefined stock. And then you deal with the second flow or the third flow in that same stock, and keep going until you come to another undefined stock. Then you went to the next stock. And so this would be the first sector, this would be the next sector. Connected stocks forming a conservative system were often presented in a single equation cluster, though organized in the same way as here. And equation clusters could also be built around important pieces of information, driving decisions like Forrester did delivery delay in case of his market growth model, quality of life in his world dynamics model, and attractiveness in his urban dynamics model. So it doesn't have to be a stock and flow system. It could be other complex computation too, which helps draw out the feedback process, gives it a logical meaning. And this was made possible by what was at that time called the non-formal programming protocol, which was a big thing in Dynamo. The computer languages at that time had to be written in a way that you first define the quantity, then use it. But in Dynamo, you could go in any sequence, and that was called a non-formal protocol. So this allowed us to first define the effect and then go back to its cause. So it followed the arrow, causal arrow, in the reverse direction. And magically, this created subsystems which could be connected together with information arrows. I'm just trying to explain how it happened. And this is something which was never documented, so I thought it's worthwhile documenting it for the posterity. Now, another thing that is interesting to note is that the level of aggregation in these models is not cast in stone. Some sectors, subsystems are large, some are small. The important thing is that they are important part of the feedback maps that they create. And we ignored all this. We tried to map each element of stock and flow into feedback loops. Feedback diagrams became very complex and hard to interpret. We separated feedback loops from stock flow structure. Feedback loops became runaway train crashing into what we call system thinking. You probably note that I'm not a fan of systems thinking because I think you cannot make any useful conclusions and cannot understand the contingencies of those conclusions. Stock and flow model became another runaway train, which crashed into forecasting. The models are so complex, hard to explain. We did not know their feedback loop. The only output they could give was forecasting. And faulty inferences from complex feedback diagrams, parallel system thinking, and non-verifiable forecasts from computational instruments have become quite pervasive, and I think these are harmful for the practice. This is not system dynamics. So what is new? The new is the ability to wire feedback map into stock and flow structure, the ability to create a multi-level hierarchy. And this creates an opportunity to reconnect system thinking to system dynamics so that they can be intertwined. All right. I'll stop there. I hope I haven't talked for too long. And there's still some time for questions, comments.
Yes, you still have 12 minutes. And there was a comment before, I think it was before when you were showing the causal loop diagrams. Was it with the modules? I think it was before urban dynamics. So Jean had a question on a slide, but I don't know which one.
If you go back to the slide that had the
Urban
sectors on it, one more.
You mean the urban dynamics, Gene?
Go forward.
Oh, go forward. To urban dynamics, right?
No, I wanted the stock and flow map for this. For the one we're currently looking at,
Yes.
I wanted the stock and flow diagram for that
A
map.
stock and flow diagram. It was a bit too complex, so I did not include it.
Well, okay, but there was a map that was in sectors just before this, though, wasn't there?
That was for the
Oh, okay,
world
okay.
dynamics.
Okay, so in Stella, or I think, when you take this sector map and display it up on the one level abstracted from this, you get all of the information flows because of all of the ghost variables that have been used in defining the sectors. So the information lines are not there. Well, the information lines and the flow lines are not there connecting from one sector to another, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
So actually, I'm a bit concerned about system thinking between separated from system dynamics, as you might have noticed. System thinking is the explanatory process. System dynamics modeling allows you to experiment with computable structures and understand the contingencies of the inferences that you make using feedback maps. And the two go together. They should never be separated. And separating them on one hand has created a discipline which is not sound. Actually, they've created two disciplines, both of which are not sound. So my position is that this separation has been harmful. Tasso, you have a question?
Yes, please. By coincidence, almost coincidence, I was looking for it actually. I was watching a video of Dana Meadows from, well, it was a very early video, black and white, of course. And Dana was explaining to the class, this was to the students, she was explaining that when we understand how the system works with causal loop diagrams, when we understand how it works, then eventually we don't need the computer. That's what she was claiming at the time. And of course, this was probably late 60s, beginning of the 70s, I believe. And okay, being Dana, of course, it's something to think of. We don't need the computer. She stated that very clearly. We shouldn't need the computer because it's up here. So, well, actually, I'm of that line of thought, actually, personally. I think if we understand, that's good enough. But so, I mean, that's a point Dana was making very, very clear. How do you think about this? How do you, I mean, are we looking back too far? Or should we look back?
No. I think that's a different point.
Okay.
I think eventually, as Forrester also used to say, that there are about 20 or so structures that can explain 90% of the situations that we deal with. Mm-hmm. So she was most likely thinking of those generic systems, ubiquitous generic systems, and they are in metaphorical models. Like people express as a model which talks about an explicit capacity portfolio and a latent capacity portfolio. And the explicit portfolio is actually driven by a positive feedback, implicit portfolio with a negative feedback, and we are not even aware of it. And that can be applied to many situations. Urban dynamics, in my view, is a very good structure to deal with economic development in poor countries because it can replicate the Malay. It talks about the interaction between various elements of an economy that can lead to multiple manifestations. So I can talk about economic development if I know urban dynamics well. Likewise, world dynamics is a system in which we are talking about the capacity constraints, sort of hidden under several layers of systems. There are several constraints. And if we know that system, we can talk about similar situations. So my interpretation is that's what she meant, that if you have intimate knowledge of ubiquitous structures which manifest in many situations, you don't have to build model every time. You carry in your head the wisdom that you have gained, and you can pull out from that inventory and apply it to a relevant situation. So actually, I'm trying to document that also. Those not 20, but I have like 12, 15 ubiquitous structures I've tried to collect, which are widely applicable. And I think that's a very important part of system thinking, that over time, you become wiser, you know those ubiquitous structures, and you are able to relate it to specific problems.
Khalid, you referring to the archetypes?
Archetypes is a term which has been used usually in the feedback. I mean, the archetypes I've seen started with Sange's book. These are coupled feedback loops. I'm talking about the stock and flow models. To me, urban dynamics is one of those generic systems. And world dynamics is a generic system whose the wisdom from which can be transferred to other situations. So I don't know what to call them.
Well, Bertalanffy talked about frequently recurring structures, but he never called them archetypes.
I don't call them archetypes. I call them generic systems or metaphors, systems thinking metaphors. Because I think the term archetype has been used in terms of feedback, and I don't want to confuse just feedback loops with
so you are identifying frequently recurring structures, ubiquitous, which are in fact different from the archetypes?
There might be some of them might relate. The archetypes are not many. There are 6 or 7 archetypes. And these might relate to more complex situations. And the problem with those archetypes is that, as I said, you cannot know the contingencies of your inferences that you make just from feedback loops, coupled feedback loops, which we call archetypes.
Correct.
So if we have more drawn out models, say set up in a metaphorical framework, like I have a model of farmers, bandits, soldiers, which I do not call an archetype, I call it a metaphor that you can apply it into many situations relating to firms, economies, regions, global settings, within an organizational settings. There are these 3 types of sub-institutions, the interaction of which creates multiple patterns of behavior. And if you create a feedback map, which the archetypes, that's how they're named. Sometimes a name is used for a particular thing, and it creates images of a similar type, and that's the reason I don't use archetype. But if you have an inventory of such models and you understand their contingencies, then you can apply them more wisely elsewhere. So that's why I would refer to them as metaphorical systems, metaphorical models, generic systems, not archetypes.
So, Professor,
Yes.
we have 1 minute left, but we actually have a bunch of questions in the chat. I just didn't want to interrupt because I think it's rude. But are you available to stay a little longer
Sure.
to answer these questions? Okay.
No problem.
So, a quick question. What are the outcomes from a model that are worthy to discuss? So what's important for a research paper?
For a research paper, you want to first of all understand that each parameter in your model could be mapped to some policy that can be changed. And once you have mapped that, you should understand the sensitivity of changing that parameter. And that would translate to implementing that policy which you have mapped it to. That's one. And it's important to document both the sensitive and insensitive parameters. The sensitive parameters have the potential of creating policy interventions. Changing a parameter actually changes the dominance structure of the feedback loops, which are driving behavior in a system. And so that sensitivity analysis, and I don't believe in a blind sensitivity analysis using any automation there. I believe in changing one parameter at a time, understanding the impact, and then isolating a critical intervention which changes behavior substantially. And after that, looking at the other insensitive interventions and see how they behave with the change, with the parameter change that created a substantial change in the outcome. And I'll give you an example. Like in Forrester's urban dynamics model, there are a lot of policy interventions which are ineffective. And there is one intervention which is slum clearing policy, which makes a big change in the mix of the housing, mix of the infrastructure and businesses and people. And after you have made that change, if you add to it some other interventions which were ineffective on their own, in fact, they further improve the behavior. So there is a fundamental policy change, and there are hygienes which can further refine the outcomes. And it's very worthwhile carrying out experimentation with your model to understand what is the fundamental driver of change and what are the hygienes and how combining them can help. This is after you understood your model.
Another question was, so you do not want to represent all the relationships? Wait, I'm a little confused about this question. I'm just going to read it as is. As I understand, all the relationships in causal loop diagrams you do not want to model that in a stock flow, right?
Stockflow has a lot in them. And if you try to build a corresponding causal map, it doesn't tell you very much. Causal map is something that you can process in your mind. I recall when I was a graduate student, they gave us an article to read, which was actually published in America, published in JASA, and the article title was "The Magical Number 7 plus minus 2." I don't know. Many of you might have seen that article. It's sort of a classic. And the author proposed that you can process about 7 things in your mind, plus or minus 2, not more than that. So if you have a simple feedback map, which feedback map is sort of invokes thinking. It has to be processed in your mind. It cannot be very complex. So I don't know if I've answered that question. If the question was that, why you do not map all the causal connections from stock and flow to a causal diagram, I'd say don't, because it's not very useful.
I've read that backwards because it has to do with the way I think. I start with stock flow. I don't start with causal loop. So I apologize for that. But the person asked, they're starting with a causal loop, and then you do not want all of that.
No, actually, I favor
Is that
starting
correct?
with the causal loop, but I favor starting with an aggregate causal loop diagram, which translates into, like in this slide, the causal loops are between sectors: pollution sector, population sector, quality of life sector. Start with that. Don't start with the microstructure of the model presented as causal map. That's not very helpful. So causal diagram is at an aggregate level, and it's definitely helpful to start with that. That's our dynamic hypothesis. It has to be aggregate and at a higher level. That's what I advise.
Okay. Another question was, is the stock flow structure metaphors list available somewhere? And I think others have answered that actually, but is that the systems thinking metaphors paper that you have on ResearchGate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's
I'll
I'm trying to clean it up further.
Okay.
That's what it is.
And another question was, if the separation between system dynamics and systems thinking would not be allowed, many people would be deprived of a research method. Data might not always be available, and also not everyone has the access to the information or education to learn system dynamics. I think the separation is part due to the lack of accessibility of system dynamics. What is your take on this?
I think as Tessa and I were talking, if you have an inventory of structures like the system thinking metaphors that we have just discussed, and if it's possible to transfer the wisdom from those to a multiple situations, that is useful system thinking. Now, I think we have the illusion that feedback maps is a tool. I think it's an adequate tool. You cannot get very far just with feedback maps. So if you're working on a serious research, I think really cannot be limited to an unsound tool. To me, it's not a very sound tool. And you are right that system dynamics, model building, training is not widely available, but then that's not a justification for using an unsound tool. You come to inferences which has many contingencies. These are not valid inferences. So I don't know what to say there, but I think that tool is not robust.
I have something to say about this.
Yes,
I know
please.
at WPI, we're trying to reduce the tuition costs to make it more, the WPI course is more available for others. And the society has a lot of resources for people to.
Yes, that's right. We are trying to do that. I don't know. We have to make sure that the school can meet its expenses. And also, we want to make sure that the education component is accessible widely. And so these are two conflicting criteria. I hope the conflict between the two will be resolved soon.
So just, okay, here, can you show the slide with the CO2 stock again?
Yes.
I don't know if this person wants to unmute and ask the question. I'm not sure if this person's still here.
Yeah.
Yes.
This
I
one.
also don't say your names in case you want to be anonymous. But all these questions are from people in the chat.
So this slide?
No, that's fine. That's not the one. It's the second one after that, I think. No, it was simple. I just saw it. I think you just passed it.
In this one?
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, what's that? Additions. Are you talking about additions of CO2
Yes.
into the?
Right.
Yeah.
So that could be part of the CO2 concentration, but I just put it separately. It's just the inflow that drives the whole system.
Mm.
I can send you a simple model if send me an email at saeed@wpi.edu.
Yeah.
I'll send you.
Great.
I think that is the last of the questions in the chat, correct? I think so. If I miss something, please let me know or unmute yourself. But we're 12 minutes past the hour.
Excellent. Yes, we are on time. Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to this group. And feel free to contact me if you have more questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And for others for attending.